Okay, so Bruchim Habaim, welcome everybody. Delighted to have you here for a little bit of a study together this evening, or perhaps a little bit of consideration of what we might be doing as we approach Pesach. I'm just going to put something up on the screen for a moment. I'll be sharing the screen occasionally, and so hopefully that'll work fairly smoothly. So just somebody give me a thumbs up when the screen shows up. It doesn't always show up immediately. Okay. So I usually ask at the beginning of these types of sessions, of preparatory sessions or whatever, try to get a sense of what people's expectations are and what you've expected from the series of 3 sessions that we've had, of which this is the last. So but before you respond to that, and maybe you can share in the chat box if you'd like, what do you understand from this picture? What does this picture do for you?
Night is different than any.
So remember, I suggest put them in the chat box rather than speak out loud. Okay, so somebody, just in case you can't read, or if by accidentally they send it to me specifically, determination, meal is all inclusive. All right, so one of the things we obviously have a challenge with, and perhaps it's been eating alone. Yeah, that's so certainly these days when we're faced with what we are with regards to COVID and isolation and the inability to join with others virtually, we might find ourselves in the best of situations facing our favorite pet at the meal table. But that may be only something that's extended to others who perhaps haven't experienced something like this in the past. Being alone on Pesach is not something new. It's something new for many of us. It's something new that perhaps we haven't personally experienced. And we're going to kind of touch on this a little bit as we go through some elements of the importance of Pesach and the Seder this evening. So I would say that my goal is not to really provide you with materials for your Seder. I mean, I'll make a number of suggestions and offer some elements that might be an addition, and a worthwhile one at that, to your Pesach celebrations. But I really want to consider what the Seder could be, what it should be from a somewhat broader perspective. And as a matter of fact, there are an incredible number of resources available online. If you look in the chat box, I've put a few sites that are among my favorite. They're by no means the only ones, but they're ones that have a very creative, inclusive approach to what might be included in the Seder. myjewishlearning.com, haggadot.com, heyalma.com, and hadar.org. And as I said, there are dozens and dozens of sites, but I found that these 4 provide a wonderful variety, and a creative one at that, of material that you might want to consider adding to your Seder. So when we think about the Seder, what exactly is the Seder and what does it do for us and how should we view it? So I want to read something to you that I found in the Union Haggadah, printed by the Central Conference of American Rabbis in 1923. The moral and spiritual worth of the hallowed institution of the Seder, which has become a vital part of the Jewish consciousness, is priceless. We should suffer an irretrievable loss were it allowed to pass into neglect. To avert such a danger has been the anxious thought to which the Union Haggadah owes its origins. In carrying on the chain of piety which links the generations to each other, it is necessarily, frankly, to face and honestly to meet the needs of our own day. The old Haggadah, while full of poetic charm, contains passages and sentiments wholly out of harmony with the spirit of the present time. Keep in mind, this is written in 1923. Hence, the proper editing of the old material demanded much care and attention on the part of the editors of the first edition of the Union Haggadah. Benefiting by their labors, those entrusted with the tasks of its revision are able to present a work at once modern in spirit and rich in those traditional elements that lend color to the service. And I want to just read to you the order of the Seder. Everyone's familiar with the list of order that we read near the beginning, even to some kind of chant, the one that begins Kadesh. You're all familiar with that, right? So this is the order of the service in the Union Haggadah. Kadesh, Karpas, Yachatz, Magid, Motzi, Matzah, Korech, Maror, Shulchan, Orech, Safun, Barech, Halel, Nirtzah. Who consider themselves sufficiently familiar and recently attentive to what I read, that you could tell me, is there anything different about that list than the list that you read? Any additions? Any deletions? Alex, didn't we miss washing hands? Yes, indeed. There's no urchatz and there's no rachza. So you might ask, and I have no intention of giving you the response, the answer to that, but you might ask, why did those who envisioned a modern approach to the Haggadah in 1923 decide to take out the ritual of washing the hands? So that's a question which is of great relevance and might be of great interest as well, but I'm not going to answer it because when we do our own revision of our Haggadah, if we do, our own consideration of what elements we decide to include, what, in the words of the editor of the Union Haggadah, what presents for us at once a work that is both modern in spirit and rich in those traditional elements that lend color to the service, are those our considerations when we decide what to include, or do we have other criteria in deciding what might be best offered during the course of a Seder? The moror was also out of place. That's right, Eric. So there's some minor differences there, and perhaps some significant ones. I know that in our family, the tradition of the washing was something. Actually, I always looked forward to being the one to carry around the bowl with the water and the towels swung over my arm like a maitre d' at a fancy restaurant or something like that. But having said that, the elements that we include or decide to eliminate from the Seder should be of great significance. It shouldn't be something that we forgot to do, but it should be something that we give intent to, whether we add or whether we take away something from that experience. So before we get back to that, I'm going to delve into a little bit of the personal. And these questions that I'm going to put on the screen are not questions that I would intend for you to share your responses with others, either with me personally or in the chat box with others. But I would suggest that you write down at least the first things that come to mind when you see these questions, okay? So we talk about freedom from slavery. If we want to give it some kind of meaning, it's wonderful to think of being slaves in Egypt, but none of us can possibly have an idea of what that is. But it would also be true to say that we are slaves to certain things. And I'm not talking about the traditional ethical comment about being slave to mammon, to money or something like that. But I want you to take a moment and think about what would you be willing to use the term slave to consider yourself connected to, often without full will, meaning you happen to do things not really because you want to do them, because you feel forced to do them. So perhaps write down a couple of things that come to mind. And again, don't share those with us right now. These are something for you to consider. So take a moment and think about that. And just so you don't get overly depressed by the thought that you feel enslaved in some way to something, think about those things in a positive sense. What did you manage to free yourself from this past year? And this has been a year of incredible impact on our lives in very many ways, often making life much more belabored, much more challenging. But at the same time, there's been a lot of positive things that people speak about. And people have come to different conclusions, perceptions about certain things they've done in the past, whether it be behavior, preconceptions, etc. So is there anything that you could at this point celebrate redemption or freedom or liberation from, as we're about to begin Pesach, that you managed to free yourself from this past year? So try to think of a couple things and maybe write those down, if you have an awareness of that. Perhaps not. I think these are also valuable exercises to partake of at the Seder a little bit, and then maybe in the presence and limited presence, I might say, of family is something that where you might be willing to share a little more than you might be able to do with a group such as ours this evening. So I'll leave that with you, the introspection, and you can perhaps delve into that, deal with that as you see fit in the coming days. I find there are many elements to say that are fascinating, but the one I'm going to try to focus on this evening is one that I think we say because it's near the beginning, we're aware of it, we acknowledge its importance in a sense, but do we really have a full sense of what it's about? And of course, what I'm talking about is where we begin the Magid section. Anybody know what the first words of the Magid section are? So the famous halachma anya diachalu avatana. So this idea of something that our ancestors did, that here we are practicing that same tradition, one out of necessity in the past, one out of perhaps nostalgia today. But why is this such an essential part of the Seder? So let's take a look at the text. First of all, this idea of an emphasis on bread of affliction, bread of destitution. The words used are quite interesting and quite powerful, that our ancestors ate in the land of Egypt. Now, does that mean they ate this lachma anya, this poor bread, this bread of affliction, the entire time they were there? What do they mean by bread of affliction? Is it the bread itself, or is the circumstances in which the bread was eaten? We often talk about halachma anya. Here are the matzahs that we're eating. We're eating this matzah, this pathetically dry, tasteless cracker, wafer, that we suffer through during the course of Pesach, to remember what our ancestors ate. But is that really what this is talking about? They may have eaten better than we think. It wasn't that they ate matzah. We know that the matzah was only what they ate as they were leaving Egypt, because they didn't have time to allow the yeast to take hold and for the dough to rise. But they ate whatever they ate under circumstances that were afflicting, that were of destitution. So the impact of the circumstances was more important than actually what they ate. And I don't think I need to tell you, when we go back to the picture of the man sitting with his dog at the table, that meal looked pretty good. As long as you're not a vegetarian, there's plenty of food on the table. I imagine it was decently prepared, but the circumstances under which we're eating it, or at least they're eating it, are far from ideal. And I don't need to tell you how much the circumstances under which we experience something determine the nature of what it is we're eating or wearing. Those impact on us a great deal more than the actual food itself. So when we talk about bread of affliction, we're talking about the circumstances. We're not talking about the actual bread itself. And it talks about, what does it focus on? It focuses on us. It focuses on what we're doing. But at the same time, it's considering, not in comparison, but what's happening with those around us. So whatever we have even eating this lachma anya, we're inviting others to come and eat with us. And we often look at that as saying, meaning here we are feasting on something, interestingly, lachma anya, but we want to allow others to experience that. We're doing it for the benefit of the others. We're doing somebody else a favor. And yet, if we want to understand the impact of trying to imagine ourselves as our ancestors were, the benefit is not necessarily for the people we're inviting, or at least it's not solely for them. The benefit is for us. We're inviting them to our table, not because we're sitting there alone with our cat or dog or guinea pig or whatever, but we're inviting them because our experience is not as rich as it can be. And by inviting others to our table, it by no means is something that we do in any altruistic way. It's something that we're doing for our own benefit, to make the circumstances of our Passover feast or our Passover lachma anya something that is more rewarding, something that is more impactful, something that is more significant for us. And I'm going to come back to this issue of inviting those to partake with us in a moment. And at the same time, it talks about the fact that whatever our circumstances are now, we strive for something better for next year. It's very similar in a sense, if you think about the kinds of things we say on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. We may be evaluating the past year and seeing where we are now with what we've done. But next year, we're going to do better. We're going to not just repent for our sins now, but we're going to make an effort to do things better next year. The whole idea as well on Kol Nidre, this idea of all the vows which we've made, they're now canceled, and we have a clean slate going forward into the next year. So this ability to evaluate what we have as good or as unfavorable as it may be, that there's a striving for something better. And it's interesting, I found another Haggadah printed in New York in 1912 at the Hebrew Publishing Company on 83 to 85 Canal Street. I don't know if anyone's been there or recall that. And the price was 10 cents, no less, for this Haggadah. And it gives an interesting interpretation in Yiddish of this halachma declaration. I'm just going to read the last part of it because it's quite interesting. It says, when it talks about L'shana haba, hashata hacha, this year we are here, L'shana haba ba'arad Yisrael, hashata avdei, this year we are slaves, next year we are going to be free people, as it says in the English here. So what does it say in the Yiddish here, as a bit of an interpretation? It says, Dos Jahr seinen wir da. Zum Jahr, das wird kommen, in Land Eretz Yisrael und frei von Yetzer Hara. So what does it say? It says, in one sentence, it says, this year we are here. Next year, we're going to be in the land of Israel and free from our evil inclination, from Yetzer Hara. It doesn't talk about some kind of absolute freedom. It talks about freedom from Yetzer Hara. And what do they mean by Yetzer Hara? Perhaps they're referring to this idea of focusing only on ourselves, taking advantage of others. Who knows what the circumstances were when the editor, the Yiddish editor, wrote this back in 1912, what they were thinking of. The Yetzer Hara, the idea of making profits at the expense of others. I was just reading something. Actually, I was reading sections from the East River by Shalom Ash, and there's a section there that talks about the Triangle shirtwaist factory fire in 1911. Perhaps that's something that motivated the person to write that issue about the Yetzer Hara. In any case, this interpretation about seeing something personal and not just some kind of reflection on a past historical event is something that we should see in the halachma itself. I'm going to come back to the halachma in a few minutes, but I want to spend some time on something that perhaps we take for granted. And I know there are those of you who have made the effort, I don't know if you're doing it this year, who've made the effort in the past to compile a Haggadah of your own, to decide what might be relevant for your family and your guests, and to take those elements which have the greatest relevance in terms of your celebration of Pesach. So I want to consider, when we look at a Haggadah, there are a number of factors that might be of interest. So first of all, perhaps a little less today, but in the past, there were companies that sponsored Haggadot. And you're all probably familiar. I'll put this up on the screen. I don't know if you can see it. Haggadah Shel Pesach, sponsored by the Maxwell House Coffee Company. And good to the last drop, of course, and kosher for Passover. So I just want to read, this is, by the way, from 1938. And I just want to read you what they say at the beginning here. The Seder service has existed for centuries and is a Jewish national institution. The Haggadah, which contains all the ceremonies and prayers pertaining to this service, is naturally a requisite. And so, General Foods Corporation, packers of Maxwell House Coffee, whose relations with the Jewish people have always been most friendly, take pleasure in presenting this new up-to-date edition of the Haggadah, arranged in a most simplified and attractive form. They also take great pleasure in extending best wishes for a happy and joyous holiday. So a nice connection to not necessarily a Jewish company. Then there's another one I found from what year is it from? 1955. Published by Schulzinger Brothers Linotyping and Publishing Company on 21 East 4th Street in New York, and it's sponsored by Barton's. So it says here, Barton's staff and writers works the year round planning and creating exciting new material for its ever-growing library of Jewish holiday treasure. Authentic facts and interpretations are carefully gathered from traditional sources to bring to as many people as possible, especially to the children, the materials most likely to enhance their respect and admiration for their historical heritage and to increase their interest in learning more about the laws, customs, and symbols of their faith. Original stories are written, games and puzzles are designed. No holiday package leaves Barton's factory without its educational booklet. Barton's 1,000 employees are honored to take part in this great movement, spearheaded by our leading rabbis and educators to bring children closer to Jewish living through education. We consider ourselves fortunate to be able to commemorate the Jewish holidays and heroes by combining Jewish educational material with our packages of kosher candies. And then there's a Haggadah produced in the 1990s by El Al. But they've taken a different focus because they're doing it in cooperation with a couple of organizations, charitable organizations. One by, the main one here is Alut. Alut is the Israeli Society for Autistic Children. Autistic adolescents and adults created the drawings which decorate this Haggadah at Alut's occupational and day centers, which are a source of employment, rehabilitation, and professional guidance services for their members. Their aim is to promote the development of each member according to the individual's talents. So when we choose a Haggadah, whether sponsored by a company or supporting the efforts of a charitable organization, it puts us kind of in a bit of a frame of mind for what we're looking for. And even the title of the Haggadah can be something incredibly significant. So if you look at the titles here, most of the titles you're familiar with, I don't know what title you use for Haggadah. Shortly, I'm going to ask you that. So we have titles here called the Passover Haggadah. You might ask, well, why do you need Passover Haggadah? What other Haggadah is there other than a Passover Haggadah? Seems a bit unnecessarily. One called the Model Seder. What does that mean, the Model Seder? It means the ideal Seder. The essence of the Seder is what's included in this as opposed to other Haggadot. The family Seder. Israel Passover Haggadah. What might be included in that is different from another Haggadah? A Haggadah Shel Pesach B'Charuzim. A Haggadah that is all in the form of rhyme. This is a Haggadah in Hebrew, of course. And I'm going to show you some other names of Haggadot, which you may be familiar with. And I want you to take a moment just to think as I go through each one, what comes to mind when you see this Haggadah? Because when we choose a specific Haggadah, and many of us may use a rather regular, if I can use that term, Haggadah, standard form that's called the Passover Haggadah. But nowadays, there are many more different types of Haggadah, and each one perhaps has a different approach, a different emphasis. And some of these may be familiar to you. And each of them focus on perhaps something that is outside the range of the standard Haggadot that perhaps many of us were brought up with. So who's familiar with this one? Who's seen this one before, A Different Night? That's something that's been around for a while, so that's probably familiar to many of you. The Women's Seder Source Book. So there are all sorts of elements in there that would give a great emphasis and do, and it is a wonderful source book, focusing on some of the rituals, it says readings for use of the Passover Seder, that deal more with some of the perspectives of women, both historically and in present times. The Canadian Haggadah, what would a Canadian Haggadah entail? So first of all, I would tell you that it's trilingual. It's got English, Hebrew, of course, and French. Haggadat Chevron. This one's probably very unfamiliar. I don't imagine anyone's seen this before. So when you see Haggadat Chevron, the Haggadah of Chevron, what would come to mind? Maybe just throw something in the chat box, anybody who thinks of that. What would you think of a Haggadat Chevron would be emphasizing? Why would there be a Haggadat Chevron? So keep in mind, each of these Haggadot have some kind of agenda. They have some kind of emphasis, perhaps for the benefit of a group of whatever nature that may not have had the opportunity to express itself in regular Pesach circumstances. Oops, I may have missed a comment. Anyone have an idea of Haggadat Chevron? So Haggadat Chevron was published in the 1970s by one of the first groups of settlers who went to establish a Jewish presence in the old city of Hebron, near Ma'arat HaMachpelah, the caves of the patriarchs and matriarchs, not too many years after that part of the West Bank was captured by Israel in the Six-Day War. So the Haggadat Hebron has some kind of perhaps political religious statement about a Haggadah being published in a place that is significant in Jewish history and Jewish religious thought, and something that hadn't had the opportunity to be expressed for many decades, if not longer. I know it's a little blurry, the Gurs Haggadah, Passover in perdition. So what does that bring to mind, if anyone's familiar with this Haggadah? It's a Haggadah that was written in an internment camp in France in 1941 and 1942 by Jews who were being held there by the Vichy government, collaborating with the Nazis. Many of them later taken to other death camps, but this was a place where, under very harsh conditions, they managed to write their own Haggadah. Quite fascinating, the story of, they didn't have the type of tools, publishing house, of course. This is all written by hand and distributed among the Jews who were there, and several hundred of them. So you can only imagine the conditions under which this Haggadah was actually written. And then there's the Haggadah, how to keep the conversation and wine flowing at your Seder. So the idea that you have to do something that is perhaps antithetical to the standard Haggadah in order to keep people's interest, meaning what we have usually done is not sufficient, either for a younger generation or for our own growing questioning and inquisitiveness as we move along. And along those similar lines, Passover parodies, short plays at the Seder table. So they do have the perhaps basic elements in there, but it's something that is designed, I guess, more to entertain or at least educate in an entertaining way. Let's put it that way. And sometimes the terms we use can be very different in a different context. So the Passover survival kit, I'm not sure if there's also a survival kit for the high holidays. How, again, similar to the two we looked at before, how do we deal with the fact that there's a less of an interest in maintaining the same template, the same traditions that we have of either Pesach or other festivals in the Hebrew calendar? How do we deal with that? What are the elements that are going to help us survive perhaps the tedious nature, as we've come to see often, the Seder experience and other such experiences? And of course, in a very different use of the word survivor, this is a survivor's Haggadah. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but it was put together by a group of Jews who survived various death camps and gathered in Munich, at the end of the Second World War, those who'd gone through some transit camps as well. And in 1946, put this Haggadah together, and a very, not just by the color of the cover, but a very dark Haggadah, describing often in the most cynical of terms, the experiences they had and how that relates to what one might be celebrating or trying to celebrate during Pesach. Slavery, not in the ancient terms, but in very real, modern, contemporary experience of the Shoah, of the Holocaust. Not something that's going to bring smiles to people's faces at a Seder, but one which perhaps allows you to understand as close as to anything what life might have been like in Egypt 3,000 years ago and more. And lastly, we often look at our traditions, with this contemporary attention to try to make it entertaining, try to make it engaging for the younger generation. But there's incredible variety in Jewish tradition of Pesach. We often think that the Ashkenazi, perhaps here and there with some element of Oriental or Sephardi tradition put in as an exotic addition, is something that gives us a sense. But their Haggadot, if similar in their basic structure to the one that we use, have an incredible variety of different elements and interpretations, and perhaps most importantly, that are even in different languages. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. So when we make a choice about a Haggadah, it's incredibly powerful how it impacts on our experience. The moment we look at a title, it's going to say something about perhaps the way we're going to view that Haggadah, what our emphasis is going to be for the Seder, maybe a theme that we've chosen for that year, whatever it may be. I've only given you a very tiny sampling of the hundreds and hundreds of Haggadot that are out there. So let me just take a moment and ask, what is the title of the last Haggadah that you used at your last Seder? Who remembers the title if it was something other than Passover Haggadah? So just kind of throw it in the chat box if you recall. Harry Potter Haggadah, A Different Night, the Polychrome Historic Haggadah, that's We Were Slaves, an Interactive Haggadah. I know there's also the Rose Roth Family Haggadah. Okay, so my question being, when you choose a Haggadah, the family Haggadah, when you choose a Haggadah, do you choose it by the title? Do you choose it by the theme? Do you choose it because it looks a little bit different, a little bit interesting? Do you follow that? Is that the guide or the direction that your Seder takes? Or is it simply by chance that you happen to have chosen that Haggadah? Okay, so I'll leave that as an open question. And I want to deal with something a little perhaps more expansive regarding the Seder and Pesach in general. When we look at what Pesach is all about, if I were to ask you, and I'll leave it rhetorical for the time being, if I were to ask you what Pesach's all about, you might say, well, it's a celebration of redemption, of liberation from slavery, the beginning of the nation, the first time we feel that we're a people leaving the individual, the familial experience, and the harsh oppression in Egypt, and coming into our own, growing into a people during the course of 40 years in the desert, etc. But I think that and somewhat based on the choosing of halachma anya to begin the magid, the narrative of the Seder, I think there's something much more radical about the nature of Pesach and what the Seder should be if it isn't quite that. And that is, I would dare to say that the Pesach, and not just Pesach, but the three of our festivals, and I'll come to that in a second, those festivals are all about vulnerability. And what do I mean by that? Think of any nation or people in terms of what they celebrate. Think of our neighbors to the south. When they celebrate their Independence Day, they're celebrating a fantastic victory over the British 200 plus years ago. The ability to organize, the ability to take up arms and fight for freedom as opposed to tyranny and oppression. So it sounds a little bit like our experience, but it's far from our experience. And if you look at the national festivals and national holidays of most people, you'll find that for the most part, and certainly not only, but for the most part, they celebrate a victory of strength, a victory not necessarily only a military one, but a victory that is one that shows their power, their ability to overcome. Pesach, if you look at it, is not that. Pesach is an acknowledgement of how weak we were, how vulnerable we were, how we lacked independence, how we lacked strength. Think about it for a moment. Slaves coming out of Egypt, what did they have with them? They had nothing. They talk about the fact that they took gold and silver and all sorts of valuable things from the Egyptians. Okay, that's not exactly a demonstration of power or independence. That's perhaps taking advantage of a situation, depending on how we interpret that. And marching through the desert for 40 years, what are we talking about in terms of our national experience? We're talking about being exposed to the elements, having this perhaps blind faith in a leader who, when that leader disappears for a brief period of time, we resort to something we're familiar with. The idea that let's go back to the gods and idols that we worshipped, or at least were subjected to in Egypt, because we can't handle this independence. So if anything, Pesach is a celebration of how vulnerable we were. And it's, I would even dare say, an embracing of that vulnerability. And if you look at Shavuot and Sukkot as well, what is Shavuot? We're at the base of Mount Sinai, waiting to get some set of instructions from God brought down by Moses. Are we there by choice? No. And as I said before, the moment we don't have our leader with us, the one element of strength that which we might identify, we seek to go back to our previous circumstances of slavery. We're willing to be slaves in Egypt rather than have to deal with things on our own. Is that something that sounds to you like national pride? Is that something that other nations would choose to celebrate? No. But Judaism chooses to celebrate that. And the third festival, Sukkot. What is Sukkot about? It's embracing the temporary and fragile nature of our desert dwellings. Uncertainty. Who knows what can come by? Some flash flood, some horrible sandstorm. We're at the whims and the will of nature, supposedly protected by God, who provides water and manna and pheasants, etc., and food. But it's nothing that we do on our own. We have no ability to secure those basic resources on our own. All those three festivals, in their initial expression, are an acknowledgement of how vulnerable we were as a people for a certain period of time. Granted, those three festivals, including Pesach, become something very different when we enter the land and build temples, magnificent in structure and aesthetics, admired by other nations, and for which we could feel a great pride for centuries while they stood. But the initial expression of those festivals are one far from a powerful nature, far from an independent nature. And you might ask, so why does Judaism choose to celebrate vulnerability in such an open and expressive manner? All those festivals, and Pesach more than any of them, even if you consider the initiative shown by Nachshon, according to the Midrash at the Yam Suf, where they're waiting there by the sea, the Egyptians behind them, and only when Nachshon takes the initiative and dives into the water do the waters spread apart and they pass through the dry land. Okay, it's a great story, it's a great Midrash, but short of that, one person from, as they describe, 600,000, that's national pride in initiative and independence? No. Our festivals, Pesach more than any, demonstrate that we are willing to acknowledge the fact that we can be vulnerable. We need to accept that vulnerability. And why do we need to accept that vulnerability? Because Gerim Hayinu Beretz Mitzrayim. What is the purpose of all these celebrations? What is the purpose of all the laws, more than 30 times mentioned in the Torah, about seeing, acknowledging, and dealing in a fair and compassionate manner with those who are less fortunate? The poor, the destitute, the orphan, the widow, and more than anyone else, the stranger, the ger. Ki gerim heyitem beretz Yisrael, because you were strangers in Egypt. And it's a great thing to talk about being strangers in Egypt, being slaves in Egypt, but it's more than being slaves, it's being strangers more than anything else. Because if anything dissociates us from a sense of comfort and complacency, I would say, it's being foreign, it's being strangers. It's one thing to be a slave if it's in the land, in your own land. But when you're a slave in a land that is not yours, you're doubly impacted by the sense of alienation and disenfranchisement. And if we want to understand the meaning of Pesach, then we have to try to get into the minds and understand what it means to be a stranger, what it means to be vulnerable. And, we always say, it's necessary for us to see ourselves as if we were at Mount Sinai, as if we came out of Egypt. It's a great saying. It's a beautiful idea. But let's face it, as descriptive and expressive and powerful as Hollywood may be, we're not going to feel that we came out of Egypt following Charlton Heston or Steven Spielberg's creations or whatever. We're not going to feel that. We're not going to understand what it means to be that. But it doesn't mean we can't understand what it means to be vulnerable and to feel out of place. And that, from what I understand of Pesach, that's the purpose of Pesach, to get us to feel what it means to be vulnerable and out of place. Now, I don't need to ask you, although I could, when do you feel out of place? And you can think of examples, perhaps, and I'll take a very simple example. There are perhaps many that you can take, but I'll take one that maybe most of you can perhaps relate to, either through your own experience or the observance of the experience of others. And that is when you go to a shul that is not yours. And not that joke about going to a shul that's there because you're not going to go to it. When you enter a shul because you want to go to a minyan, and it's not your shul. Any of you who have been in another country and walked into a shul where the Siddur is in Hebrew, yeah, but if your Hebrew isn't great, are you going to be able to read the German, the Russian, the French, the Spanish, whatever languages are there? Probably not. Are you going to be seated in a place that you used to be seated? Probably not. Are the people going to embrace your presence there? I don't know. Some places they do. And I would ask you, from that possible personal experience that you may have had, or simply have had going to another shul in Toronto because Beth David was too far to get to Minyan, you weren't in that part of town when you needed to be at a Minyan or whatever, look at the people who come into Beth David. How do they feel? Yeah, we can say we're welcoming. That's great. Okay. But somebody who walks into a different shul, who is not a member at that shul, what are they going to feel? They're going to feel like a foreigner. They're going to feel like a stranger. And we may do our utmost to make them feel welcome, even from the initial moment. But no matter what we do, the moment they walk into a place they've never been to before, whether it's to say Kaddish or anything else, they are going to feel like a stranger. It's not their home. They don't belong there. Yes, we want to say that you can belong in any, you should feel a sense of being at home and belonging to any congregation you walk into, but we all know that's not the case. not only because of the nature of the congregation, but because of our own personal issues. We may not want to feel welcome there. We may deny the welcoming gestures that a congregation offers us. And so that is one opportunity for you to feel somewhat vulnerable and somewhat alienated because that's not your home. And why do I think that Pesach is so powerful in trying to convince us to try to understand that experience? Because it starts with halach ma'anya. It starts with avadim hayinu. It doesn't start with the status that Abraham had in the land of Canaan, the respect that he drew from other peoples there with whom he had dealings. It starts with Jacob, Arami Oved Avi. Jacob went to Aram to find a wife, but did he feel welcome there initially? No, he was taken advantage of. He was a foreigner, even among his own family members, among his own clan. He was treated differently. He was treated as a foreigner. And of course, the ultimate experience is our descent, not just literally, but metaphorically, into slavery, down to Egypt, to lose whatever sense we had of being at home in the land of Canaan, even before its conquest, but through the promise to the matriarchs and patriarchs, that was going to be our land, our ancestors' land. That one element we had of feeling at home, we, in a sense, threw away. Vayered Mitzrayma. Jacob and family went down to Egypt, and they were there. And regardless of the fact that the son, Joseph, was in a powerful position there, very influential, it didn't take long for us to be seen as foreigners. Not only as foreigners, but as a threat. It says very clearly in Shemot, what if these people become too many? This is Pharaoh saying to his ministers, if they become too numerous, they may rise up and try to overthrow us or something like that. So foreigners are always seen as a threat on top of everything else. And so whether they're enslaved or taken advantage of economically or in other ways, there's always a sense that they don't belong. And how can we attempt to understand what that means for us? So I had a very brief communication with actually somebody who's here this evening. They sent me, and so I'm going to show it to you in a moment, they sent me something that I think is very relevant, because when we talk about a narrative, we talk about Magid, we talk about this narrative starting from where Jacob goes down to Egypt with his family, we become slaves, etc. We don't start with a bright picture. We start with a very negative descent into something very unfavorable. But what if we were to begin, in order to understand not so much our own situation, but that of others, what if we were to begin here in Canada, our narrative, why not include parts of our own personal experience here in Canada? Why not include the narrative of Exodus, of homelessness, of feeling as foreigners when our ancestors, wherever they may have come from, left perhaps Western Europe, Eastern Europe, wherever, and coming to Canada? Why not is that part of our understanding and appreciation of feeling as aliens? And if we want to feel, and this is as powerful a message as in the Tanakh, in the Bible, as anything else, if we want to feel the effects of powerlessness, we want to also feel the effects of when people are in power, what do they do to those who are vulnerable? Do they use their power for good reasons, for good cause, for constructive purposes? Or do they take advantage of the power that they now have, if they didn't have it before, and exert that power over other vulnerable people? And so, because I continue to feel very troubled by what's happening in our own country, when we talk about vulnerability, especially reversal of fates, I can't help but think of beginning our narrative with what happens in North America and going back to a narrative of the people who lived here before our entry into the land. So right now, we don't feel so much foreigners anymore. Perhaps some of the recent generations of immigrants, wherever they may have come from, continue to feel that sense of alienation. But we, as having been here, most of us or our families for 2, 3, or 4, and even 5 generations, we feel that this is our land. But in a sense, we're still foreigners here with power. And foreigners who have displaced others to whom this land was part of their heritage and history going back a lot longer than the generations that we've been here. So I'm just going to share with you a narrative that acknowledges the fact that there are others in their own land who you might say have become homeless and in a sense foreigners due to the power and the abuse of power exerted by those who came here afterwards. So,
Ani, bonjour. Sarah Rockendishnakas. Shebenaning and Donjaba, Takaranto and Dai. Takaranto, a Mohawk word. The place in the water where the trees are standing. The place where the fish weirs are. My dog and I spend a lot of time walking. It's my favorite way to move through this city. For me, it's a meditative action that isn't about negotiating bike lanes or public transit, but a time to slow down and really try to see the world around me. Concrete sidewalks, parking lots, now covering the rivers and trails that once flowed freely. The Petun, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Métis, the Mississaugas all made their homes here. And many other nations expanding beyond these groups traveled through for commerce and trade for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I think of the other First Peoples' languages and the names they had for this place. I think of the ancient trails covered by the pressures of settlement. The waterways and the moderate climate of the Great Lakes made it a perfect place to fish, hunt, grow food, gather medicines and seeds for horticultural development. Rich, fertile, and abundant, Turtle Islands, Mesopotamia. Many First Peoples and their goods traveled from here all the way to the Mississippi and back. Whenever I travel somewhere new, I try to find out whose land I'm on, and I ask, who are the original occupants here? So for Indigenous peoples, land acknowledgements are not only to assert our sovereignty and treaty rights of today, but it's also a way for all peoples to feel more connected to a place. Davenport might be a street now, one I walk down regularly in my neighborhood, but it's not just another thoroughfare. For me, it's an ancient portage trail that holds Indigenous knowledge. They say the animals made the first trails that led them to water, and the people followed. I imagine the deer and the moose once made this trail, followed by the people carrying their birch bark canoes, carrying their goods to trade, and bringing stories to tell. Nations from all over Turtle Island met and traveled through this land. Many languages were spoken. Alliances and decisions were made. People from different nations met and intermarried. The dish with one spoon treaty was made. Takaranto was a meeting place and land made up of sophisticated and cosmopolitan peoples and cultures that I see reflected in the city today. I wonder, is it something in the land and the water? Land acknowledgements might seem like a small and simple gesture, but like many of our ways, they are intended to have more impact and hold more meaning than the words alone. If we pride ourselves on diversity and equality, shouldn't our story include Indigenous peoples? In this era of reconciliation, we need to share the truth first. And reimagine the narrative of this land and this city together.
So when we talk about a narrative for Pesach, we started at a certain point. But as I said, if the function and the purpose of Pesach is to have us understand a little bit about those vulnerabilities, they're personal vulnerabilities, but I think they're more significant vulnerabilities that we have to accept that others experience as a group. So we know we've talked to a great extent about Black Lives Matter this past year, but there are other groups. And I think in Canada, equally important is the indigenous issue. And I think when we talk about a narrative on Pesach, if we want to understand about oppression and those who are taken advantage of, we have to have a more inclusive narrative. It can't just be limited to Egypt. Many groups identify with Egypt. Many groups identify with liberation from Egypt and see their experience as an expression, perhaps more contemporary, of what the Israelites went through 3,200 years ago. But we need to be more expansive than that. And I think having a narrative based on a local experience brings other dimensions to that narrative that give our understanding of the meaning of Pesach much greater depth. And one of the things that perhaps helps us understand greatest is what I mentioned before. When we talk about languages, one of the things that alienates us more than anything else are languages. When we enter an area or a place where we're not familiar with the language, and certain languages have a certain connotative association for us. There are languages that sound to us wonderfully aesthetic, romantic. There are other languages that have a different sound altogether based on our own experience and based on the experience of other peoples as well. So let me just ask you, has your Haggadah ever had other than Hebrew, Aramaic, or English in it? And if so, put in the chat box if it's had another language in there, other than the odd word or something, of course. I'm talking about some translations of significance. Because I think part of our experience, if you want to get something out of the Seder and feeling alienated and foreign, perhaps it's a bit of a challenge to take a Seder or a Haggadah. Okay, great. Take a Haggadah that's in a completely other language, but take elements and either read them or listen to them in a different language that you're not familiar with. So those of you who grew up speaking Hungarian or French or another language, that's going to be familiar with you. That's not going to give you a sense of alienation. You need to pick a language that either you are not familiar with whatsoever, or that rubs you the wrong way. So if I were to ask you what languages you'd be willing to tolerate, I'm sure most of you, I hope, would be willing to tolerate French. And so out of the Canadian Haggadah, and I'm going to stick to the Halachma text, if we read it in French, voici le pain de la misère et la persécution que nos ancêtres ont mangé au pays d'Égypte. Que tous ceux qui ont faim viennent et mangent. Que toute personne dans le besoin vienne et partage le repas de la Pâque. Cette année, nous sommes encore ici. L'an prochain, nous serons en terre d'Israël. Cette année, nous sommes encore esclaves. L'an prochain, nous serons libres. So, French is one thing that should be familiar to us. It better be familiar to us, and it better be acceptable to us. Spanish, perhaps. Este el pan de la aflicción, que comieron nuestros padres en la tierra de Egipto. Todo el que tenga hambre, que venga y coma, y todo necesitado, que venga y festeje Pesach. Este año aquí, el año venidero en la tierra de Israel. Este año somos esclavos, en el próximo año seremos libres. And thanks to our resident Italian speaker in the shul, you didn't know we had one probably. I've got a rendition in Italian which I wouldn't dare to try, but I'll share her reading of the Halachmanya. So give me 1 second if I get this on.
Ah, questo è il pane dell'afflizione che mangeranno i padri nostri nella terra di Mizraim. Ciascuno che ha fame venga e mangi, ciascuno che ha bisogno venga a farci Pesach. Quest'anno qua, l'anno che viene nella terra di Israele, questo anno qua servi, l'anno che viene nella terra di Israele. Ah, questo è il pane dell'afflizione che
Okay, we won't do it twice. And of course, those are pleasant languages because we're familiar with them. Whether we understand every word or not, the sound is familiar. I also have a couple of Haggadot. I've been somewhat obsessive with collecting Haggadot the last 15 years, but I do have one in Turkish and one in Georgian. But don't worry, I won't attempt those in consideration of your oral health and the appropriate dignity due to those two respective languages. But it is fascinating to hear the Haggadah read in those two very, very unfamiliar languages. What might be a little more difficult and unpalatable is listening to the Haggadah read in German. Although many of us may not have experienced anything close to what went on during the Second World War, perhaps our parents or grandparents and those we know and have met enough survivors and witnesses to know the horror of hearing German in any context, let alone with the Haggadah. So I'm just going to read that halachma in whatever I can in German. Sieh das ärmliche Brot, das unsere Väter in Ägypten gegessen haben. Jeder, der hungrig ist, komme und esse. Jeder, der bedürftig ist, komme und halte Pessach. Dieses Jahr hier, nächstes Jahr im Land Israel. Dieses Jahr Knechte, nächstes Jahr Freie. So German's probably a little difficult to listen to. And I imagine there are other languages which are probably problematic as well. But there are many Jews who come from countries where Arabic was spoken. And I don't imagine you've ever heard a Haggadah read in Arabic. So I want to share that with you as well. Again, just the halachma, don't worry, nothing overly extensive.
Now, in the Syrian tradition, we also chanted in Judeo-Arabic. So this is the Judeo-Arabic of the Halachma Anya, as it would be chanted by Jews from Aleppo. مثل هذا حبس المساكين الذي أكل وباتنا بأرض مصر كل منو جوان يجي ويأكل كل منو متعز يجي ويعيد هل سيني هون سينيت الجاية في بلد إسرائيل هل سيني هون عابد سينيت الجاية في بلد إسرائيل بنين ما أتقين.
Okay, let me just ask any of you, what was your response to any of those languages? If something was favorable, if something was unfavorable. And when you answer that, I want you to think, are you willing to include something that is not pleasant at your Seder? I know we have elements that we read about, very challenging pieces that we've read about abuse and other issues, certainly in recent years, as well as very harsh and horrible descriptions of the Shoah, which we often read about on the second night when we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But would you be willing to include something that kind of, as I said before, rubs you the wrong way? Sounds like perhaps the grating of nails on a blackboard to some of you. And I don't know what your experience is, but with some of those languages, it can be quite challenging to listen to that. And I'm not talking about listening to halachma. A 20-second blurb about another language is not enough to make you feel alienated or uncomfortable. But perhaps if you were to take a few pages of the Haggadah and either try to read it in whatever you could do with the pronunciation, or there's plenty of material out there in terms of videos and YouTubes where you can get large sections of the Haggadah read. My suggestion would be, you want to feel vulnerable? Take something that's going to make you feel vulnerable and uncomfortable at your Seder. In my opinion, that's what it's about. It's not all fun and family time and enjoying good food and stuffing yourself and looking forward to the Seder mints at the end. There's got to be something that puts you in a situation where things are, as Shelley said, abrasive. Something that puts you out of your comfort zone. That's what the Seder is about. It's not just trying to stuff down a certain amount of matzah and it's being dry and unpalatable. That's that's a minor part of the experience. You need to really get out of your zone in order to meet the needs of Seder and of Pesach in general. And again, language is something that allows us and perhaps forces us to feel that sense of vulnerability, not knowing where we are, not knowing what we're talking about. And here, of course, you have the benefit of knowing which sections you've chosen. So you know they're singing Dayenu in Turkish, or you know they're singing some other song that you're familiar with in whatever other language. So it's not completely alien, but you can't really sing along. And that, at Pesach Seder, is alienation. Not being able to sing a familiar song because you don't know the words that are being sung. Unless you can sing those words, don't sing it. Don't sing your own words. That's I might say even cheating. That's kind of getting around the issue. Because if you were in a synagogue, if you went to a synagogue where they spoke Arabic and they started singing something, you're not going to speak, you're probably not going to sing it in English or in Hebrew if they're singing it in a specific language, because they're all going to look at you and then you'll feel out of place. So I think that's the kind of thing you need to try to do on Pesach if you want to get a real sense of what this should be about. Just a couple of other points before I let you go. When we talk about Pesach greetings, so I've often asked this to the people who come to the Chavurah service, what greetings do we offer each other on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? And we have all these familiar sayings, and we try to come up with something that is meaningful, that's appropriate. So of course on Pesach, we say Chag Sameach, because it's supposed to be a joyous festival, as alienated and vulnerable as we might feel, or should feel. We often say Chag Kasher V'Sameach. What are we saying to somebody when we say Chag Kasher V'Sameach? Make sure you keep appropriately kosher on Pesach, because that, it's important not to eat anything you shouldn't, not to mix the right things. I mean, is that the message we want to be saying? Or are we being polite? Or are we simply saying it because that's what everybody says? One of the most important parts of Pesach, as we have learned, I imagine most of us, is eating matzah, not eating bread, not eating certain things, avoiding those things. And so when we say Chag Kasher V'Sameach, we might be imparting to somebody, our understanding of Pesach, but is that not imposing on the way they may celebrate Pesach? Are we assuming that everybody keeps Pesach kashrut the same way we do? You might say Chag Geula Sameach, happy redemptive Chag. How would it be saying happy redemptive Chag to somebody from the indigenous community, or to somebody who feels themselves in a situation or in a demographic that might be oppressed, whatever it be, whether it be an ethnic identity, whether it be a gender identity, whatever. So when you offer a greeting to somebody, you want to make sure that it's something that is genuine and perhaps appropriate. I won't use the term politically correct, but we want to offer something that's going to be meaningful to someone. So we have these generic greetings, Chag Sameach. There's also Chag Yetziat Sameach. So Yetziat Mitzrayim, we talk about coming out of Egypt. But when you use that term, what does Yetziat mean? Yetziat has different connotations in Hebrew. Yetziat can mean literally, like in English, coming out of the closet, exploring and expressing and acknowledging a certain identity of yours, whether it be gender or otherwise, and perhaps in a more jovial nature, Yetziat in Hebrew, for lack of a gentler term, it talks about a bowel movement. And of course, on Pesach, that's something you might want to wish somebody, a Yetziat Sameach. That's with the challenge of matzah, of course. Or to go to the more appropriate greeting based on what we've been talking about this evening. When we talk about vulnerability and acknowledgement of that vulnerability, what would it be if you were to say to somebody in Hebrew or in English, use the English term, if I were to say, Chag Pegiut Mashmautit, have a meaningful or curative festival of vulnerability. Can you imagine wishing somebody that? I dare you to wish somebody that. Your partners, your children, your parents. And why do I dare you to say that? Because when we offer a greeting, when we offer an element that's unfamiliar, we engage people. We bring about discussion. We get them to think, Manishana, why are you greeting me in a way that's different from the way you've always greeted me in the past? Why would you say something like that? Have a meaningful festival of vulnerability. What the heck does that mean? And so the idea of Pesach, I think, is to explore, acknowledge, and embrace our sense of vulnerability. But you can only have a discussion about that if you engage people in a creative, humorous, and at some point, a deep manner. And I think some of the ways that the text allows us, if we're willing to explore them in that sense, invite us to accept some of those elements of Pesach that we haven't tried to explore before. Sometimes we're so busy with the preparation, you're so exhausted. I hope that's not the case this year, but sometimes you're so exhausted from cleaning and preparing and fixing the food. You get down, you sit to Seder, you got no strength for any significant discussion. I won't say that's the case with everybody, God forbid. I would never say that. But often, certainly, at least certain members, some members of the family are at that point because they don't have the koyach to deal with some of these more challenging and more relevant issues. When I meet with my B'nai Mitzvah students this week, I always ask them, so what are you doing to prepare for Pesach? So they look at me, what do you mean? Well, you helping clean up around the house? And so somebody said to me today, no. I said, why? Well, why not? It says, well, we haven't started yet. Okay, that's fine if you're not there yet. But the idea of taking on responsibility and making sure you're sharing those opportunities and the various tasks in order to prepare for Pesach, it frees up people, liberates them in order to explore things that are perhaps of greater meaning. So the last thing I would say is certainly in line with what we've talked about this evening. We talk about vulnerability. We talk about being without food. We talked about the fact that in Halachma, it encourages us, I would even say, enjoins us to invite people, not just wait for them to come. Nobody knocks on a door in Toronto asking for a meal. You have to invite people, you have to make the effort. And again, that effort on our part is not just for the benefit of the people who might partake of a meal together with us, it's for our benefit as well. Why? Because honestly, it makes us feel good about helping those who perhaps are in a less than fortunate situation, but it enables us to understand the purpose of Pesach. It enables us to see face to face what a vulnerable person may feel like, somebody who doesn't have the security of food. And I just want to mention a few activities, because it's only Tuesday and there's still time to do something about it. Every year there's a Passover food drive. This year, obviously, it is greatly impacted by the inability of people to join and come in person to help out. One of the organizations that, as you know of, has done a lot of work, and that is the National Council of Jewish Women. We've sent groups of families and students there for years to help prepare those Pesach packages. And usually they prepare something like 2,500 to 3,000 Pesach packages for people who don't have the funds to buy matzah or wine or any of the other regular items that we associate with the celebration of Pesach. So this year it's all being done by contract. They're contracting it out, but there's still the need for donations. So I hope that in the coming days, you consider helping out National Council of Jewish Women, or look at PassoverFoodDrive.org to help with that incredibly important effort. There are other organizations as well. I came across something called Leket Israel, the National Food Bank in Israel, and they have a very, very powerful promotion. They bring to the forefront, especially people with whom we can easily identify, because they're people like us who've been severely impacted by COVID over the last year. So it mentions David Sur, a travel agency owner. He's embarrassed to invite his family for the Seder meal because he doesn't have the means to provide a proper Seder meal. Ronen Dunn, a soldier, at least his army base, he'll be able to find food for a Seder there because he doesn't have it at home. Yael Cohen, a hairdresser, saving her tips to buy a package of matzah. And Maya in the first grade asks, how is this night different than all other nights? Maybe I'll have food to eat for a Pesach Seder. So there are people who've been incredibly and powerfully and significantly impacted in Israel as well as in Toronto. And I would urge you to try to find the means and the heart to help out some of these organizations. And of course, there's also Ve'ahavta that you're all familiar with. They just decided to go ahead with purchasing a second van in order to access the homeless and provide food for them, not just for Pesach, but on an annual basis. And of course, running one of those vans is a very expensive endeavor. And so anyone who feels that that is something with which they can identify, I would strongly urge them to be in touch with the Havta. And of course, I mentioned before the indigenous communities, and I heard two things in the last few days that continue to be troubling. One, we talk about not having enough food. There are many communities, indigenous communities in Northern Ontario and Manitoba that don't have water. They don't, it's unbelievable that there's still communities don't have water that they can drink. For whatever reason, that there hasn't been a solution that's found to that. So there's probably not something you can do immediately to help that, but I bring that to your awareness because when we talk about vulnerability, when we talk about the abuse of power on those who don't have the opportunity to confront that, we have to be aware of what's going on in our own country, in our own province, and certainly in our own city. And I mentioned language before, and I heard something today as well that was of concern. Most judges on the Canadian Supreme Court are bilingual, but they don't need to be. And there's an effort to require that judges be bilingual. And they're saying that this is something that's going to prejudice Indigenous lawyers and judges because they've got their own language. We're not talking about bilingual in Indigenous language and English, bilinguality in French and English. And how does that impact on those who have their own native language and for whom, as an adult, it would be an incredibly powerful or difficult challenge to learn another language to the level at which one might need it in order to serve on the Supreme Court as a judge. So all these issues I bring up because we want to understand our own vulnerability, and part of that is accepting and acknowledging the fact that there are those around us in our community that suffer vulnerability as well. And if we understand the message of Pesach, hopefully that's something that you take to heart. And as you endeavor to experience the best you can your level of vulnerability, you'll find the means to try to help others deal with theirs and to take a part in finding solutions for that. So I want to thank you all for joining me this evening. I'm going to end with one last video. And if you want to sneak out while the video is going, that's fine. It's a song that I'm sure you're familiar with. See if you can catch it. It's in a different language. Let's see if you can understand what the song is. Here we go. So with that, I wish you all a challengingly and engagingly meaningful festival of acknowledging
Vulnerability?
and dealing with vulnerability. Oh, wrong one, just a second. Where's that? Here we go. There's probably an ad here. Oops.
Oh, Ladino.
Oops. My apologies for the technical challenge. Let's see if we can get it dealt with.
It's in Ladino.
It is.
Our future is hanging in the balance. It's time to choose your side.
No, my apologies. I'll have to send it to you. Sorry about that. Maybe it's going to play now. Just a second.
Che l'omer con mi padre por dos levanim, y vino el gato y se comió al cabritico, que l'omer con mi padre por dos levanim, vino el perro y modrió al gato, que se comió al cabritico, que lo mercó mi padre por dos levanim, Vino el palo y ajarbó al perro, que modrió al gato, que se comió al cabritico, que lo mercó mi padre por dos levanim, Vino el fuego y quemó al palo, que ajarbó al perro, que modrió al gato, que se comió al cabritico, que lo mercó mi padre por dos levanim, Vino la agua y ya mató al fuego, que quemó al palo, que ajarbó al perro, que modrió al gato, que se comió al cabritico, que lo mercó mi padre por dos levanim, Vino el buey y se bebió la agua, ya mató el fuego, que quemó al palo, que ajarbó al perro, que modrió al gato, que se comió al cabritico, que lo mercó mi padre por dos levanim, Vino el shochet y degolló al buey, que se bebió la agua, que mató al fuego, que quemó al palo, que ajarbó al perro, que modrió al gato, que se comió al cabritico, que lo marcó mi padre por dos levanim, Vino el Rahamadret y degolló al shochet, degolló al buey, que se bebió la agua, que mató al fuego, que quemó al palo, que ajarbó al perro, que modrió al gato, que se comió al cabritico, que lo mercó mi padre por dos levanim, Vino al santo bendito y degolló al Malachamavet, que degolló el shochet, que degolló al buey, que se bebió la agua, que mató el fuego, que quemó al palo, que ajarbó al perro, que modrió al gato.
Oops. As they say, you got the idea, right? Anyway, and everyone have a wonderful and enjoyable Pesach, and don't be afraid to do a little digging and delving.
Great. Thank you so much. That was fabulous.
Thanks, Michael.
Excellent. Yes.
Thank you.
Sameach.
Chag Sameach and a healing Chag Sameach.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was wonderful.
Everybody take care. This was wonderful.
Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good night. Laila Tov.
Have a good Pesach, everyone.
Oh,
I'd
I
love
hope
to know
so.
how to